I just got off the phone with a guy another researcher that we were going all over the place about his research and how it interlocks with what the research that we've done. And I was on the phone for like an hour, so my brain's like everywhere right now. We went through the um, JFK and the USS Liberty, and then we hopped over to how all roads lead to London and all kinds of things. Pine Gap in Australia. So it was quite an interesting conversation. All right, now we're going to do corporate coup, chapter 11. All right. In his memoirs, Soviet foreign minister, sorry, Andrei uh, Gromyko wrote that he and his fellow dignitaries endeavored to establish the UN in the aftermath of World War II. He voted for it to be a headquarters in New York for a special reason. Quote, Moscow wanted to make sure Americans did not lose their interest in international affairs. He told that to the then Vice President Nelson Rockefeller. We were afraid the US would revert to its isolationist attitude. And the Soviet diplomat saying this had served as the foreign minister for nearly 30 years. So it was a plot all along to keep us involved. The US Vice President's father, John D. Rockefeller, donated the plot of land for the UN General Assembly gathered and used it as a quote unquote charitable gesture to ensure that the US didn't revert to isolationism. Washington quickly calmed Moscow's fears that it would withdraw from global affairs, adopting a decidedly interventionist foreign policy, which was the plan of World War II all along. Rather than disengage from the UN, the US officials have instead treated it as a projector of their world view. And they used it in relationship to this book when Vice President Mike Pence addressed the Security Council in April of 2019 and demanded that Juan Guaido be recognized as Venezuelan's leader. While Venezuela and other targets of Western war maintained confidence in the UN system and leaned on it for legitimacy, the US and the European allies' ability to manipulate the organization was transparent. When it came to Venezuela, the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights walked a fine line, maintaining official ties with Maduro's UN recognized government while providing critical assistance to the Washington regime change led by John Bolton. Most notably, the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights issued consequential reports in 2019 and 2020 that conveniently parroted Washington's anti-Maduro narrative, accusing Venezuela's government of crimes against humanity while completely overlooking the abuses committed by the US-backed opposition, which was paid for by USAID. The Human Rights Commission reports fed a renewed wave of attacks on human rights. They were issued under the watch of Human Rights Commissioner who had suffered torture at the hands of a right-wing US-backed dictatorship herself. This blew my mind. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights was a former Chilean president, Michelle Bachelet. She traveled to Caracas in June of 2019, and she met with numerous Venezuelan family members who had fallen victim to US-backed extremist violence in the country. And they're talking about those riots that were funded and led by Maria Machado and Juan Guaido. Among them was Ingas Esperoza. During the riots in 2017, an opposition mob attacked her 22-year-old son, Orlando Figuera, in the street, dousing him with gasoline and lighting him on fire. He was stabbed, beaten, and burnt alive, she was told, simply because of the color of his skin and because he was a supporter of Maduro's. Video of her testimony, which was published at the Gray Zone, captured Bachelet scribbling down notes and glancing over the grisly photographs. One showed the anguished young man kneeling on the ground as a gang of anti-government thugs poured gasoline all over him. Quote, "As I call on the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to make justice," Esperoza pleaded while she was sobbing, "these are not peaceful protesters. They were bloodthirsty." Bachelet should have been able to relate to the woman who was crying in front of her. Long before her 2006 ascent to Chile's presidency, the US-backed militia junta of Augusto Pinochet had detained and tortured her own father, Alberto, after he refused to support the country's 1973 coup. Alberto, who was then serving as a top Air Force officer. When Alberto Bachelet died in a Santiago prison less than a year following his arrest, Chilean authorities turned their depraved attention on his family. In January of 1975, Chilean secret police kidnapped Michelle and her mother, subjecting them to torture as well, and forced them into exile in Australia. Now, this is the same woman who has been subjected to this torture through a U.S. regime change, who is now in charge of the UN Human Rights Commission and is listening to a woman tell her that a U.S.-backed regime coup killed her son. Bachelet had testified before, quote, "They put a hood over my head, threatened me, and hit me," unquote. Despite her family's own torture under the rule of Latin America US-backed extremists, when Bachelet released her long-anticipated Venezuela report in July of 2019, it was as though her meeting with Esperoza never took place. Apparently unremoved by the testimony of Figueroa's grieving mother and other casualties that she had heard about on her visit to Venezuela, Bachelet made no mention of opposition violence at all in her report. Instead, she focused her critique entirely on the Venezuelan government, particularly its CLAP program, an effort to defend itself through the establishment of non-state civilian militias known as collectivos. And that was for the protection of the local people against insurgents. Yeah, let's talk about them. According to Bachelet, the CLAP program initiated by Maduro was not an effort to feed his population, but an intelligence gathering operation that spied on opposition families while blocking them from receiving benefits. Her evidence-free assertion are thoroughly dispelled by what we talked about earlier, where Anya, the author of this book, had went throughout Venezuela and talked to people that were pro Maduro and anti-Maduro, and they all were equally fed through the CLAP program. And in the report from the UN, it offered no evidence, not a single name of someone who was starved that opposed the Maduro government. In addition to CLAP, Bachelet directed her ire at Venezuela's collectivos, demanding Caracas disarm and dismantle this pro-government armed civilian groups, while accusing them of exercising social control. As with CLAP, Bachelet's view of the collectivos directly parroted claims of U.S. officials like John Bolton and Marco Rubio, who had branded the groups as disorderly terrorist gangs that Maduro personally commanded, which was absolutely not true. Such characterizations overlooked the obvious question: what kind of dictator promoted the arming of their civilian populations beyond the state's authority? Months before the publication of Bachelet's report, British journalist John McAvoy spent 2 weeks living with a collectivo in Caracas attempting to answer that question. When I asked him about Bachelet's portrayal of the collectivos as pro-government civilian armed groups, McAvoy asserted such a description was ahistorical. He explained her narrative discounted the fact that many collectivos were established decades before Chavez's rise. So they had been around for, it would be like our, like groups that do militia type activities here. Not only were they around since the 1960s as self-defense militias, though collectivos overwhelmingly lined up behind Chavez once he was elected, McAvoy insisted Bachelet's report stripped the Venezuelan political situation of all historical context, while buttressing the U.S.'s narrative of a criminal regime. Collectivos played a key role in obstructing a foreign-directed mercenary invasion of Venezuela in May of 2020. With this context, Bachelet's call for collectivos to disarm appeared equally to demand a Venezuelan surrender of its last line of defense against ongoing regime change operations that featured assassination attempts against the country's president. So what had been happening in the interim, just so that you guys know, and this is something that I researched separately, these collectivos are like in what we would refer to as like every city and county. And the Venezuelan people knew that back in the 60s, that they were subjected to infiltration from Colombia and the drugs. And they had armed their citizens to be able to keep narco terrorists out of their country. And there's a lot of reports in other forums on international news sites that you can read about them interdicting drugs. So one of the setups that we know the CIA loves to do is run drugs through a country and then blame that country for running drugs when they have nothing to do with it. These armed militias stop them from doing that. As we're going to find out, one of these armed militias actually saved a CIA-funded assassination team from gaining territory, actually approaching the shore. They arrested the foreigners, they just happened to be US people, that were going to go and try an assassination attempt. And we're going to learn that in another chapter. But that's what these people do. They are like the deputies in the local community. After undermining Venezuela's right to feed and defend itself, Bachelet issued a full-fledged defense of U.S. sanctions on the country, dismissing criticisms of the measures as Maduro's assigning blame for his own shortcomings. Her analysis was not only contradicted by evidence presented throughout this book, but also by the U.S. government itself. Months before Bachelet released her report, the U.S. State Department published an assessment of its Venezuela policy that openly touted Washington's central role in Guaido's ongoing coup attempt. Posted in April 2019, the report boasted that sanctions had successfully cut Venezuela's government off from U.S. financial markets and impaired its ability to generate oil revenue. Though the State Department deleted the fact sheet within hours of its publication, Anya had already obtained a copy and published it at the Gray Zone. Among the key outcomes of U.S. Venezuelan policy in 2019, the U.S. State Department on this fact sheet celebrated the following accomplishments. Guaido had announced his interim presidency. $3.2 billion worth of Venezuela's overseas assets were frozen. Maduro's government was cut off from U.S. financial markets and unable to access credit at any of the normally accessible places like the IMF. Venezuelans' oil production and therefore government revenue was drastically reduced. Make that economy scream, as the old Chicago boys said. Or was that Kissinger? That was Kissinger. It's a list of confessions, Venezuela's UN ambassador Samuel Moncado said. He was not alone in expressing shock at the document. Quote, "If I were the State Department, I wouldn't brag about causing a cut in oil production," Mark Weisbrot, an economist and co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, remarked. Quote, "This means even more premature deaths than the tens of thousands that resulted from the sanctions last year," unquote. Indeed, the very month that the State Department released its Venezuela fact sheet, Weisbrot co-authored a report with economist Jeffrey Sachs, concluding that U.S. sanctions contributed to a 31% increase in Venezuelans' mortality rate between 2017 and 18 alone. Yet, just as she ignored the State Department's own statistic admission that U.S. policy was behind their economic collapse, Bachelet completely discounted the report authored by these economists. Instead, she provided official UN cover for Washington's financial war and justified attacks on the CLAP program, including the extrajudicial kidnapping of its facilitator, Alex Saab, 1 year following her report publication. The U.S. deplores these human rights abuses in Venezuela and calls on international community. This is part of the State Department's tweet. The U.S. deplores these human rights abuses in Venezuela and calls on the international community to take steps to hold those responsible accountable. That was the State Department's response to the UN report being published, signaling Washington's satisfaction with the UN report. The UN Human Rights Council's obsession with Venezuela intensified in September 2020 when it published a report accusing the government in Caracas of crimes against humanity. Initiated the previous fall, the investigation was not only designed to undermine Caracas's official cooperation with the Human Rights Commission, but to distract from social upheaval that befell several Venezuelan U.S.-aligned neighbors throughout 2019 and 2020. During that period, neoliberal governments in Chile, Ecuador, Colombia, and Honduras faced a wave of protest and labor strikes fueled by a popular rejection of austerity and increased state sanctioned violence in the region. As millions poured into the streets in each government, they were met with vicious repression. Facing backlash in international media, these governments banded together at the UN Human Rights Council to deflect attention onto their favorite regional boogeyman, Venezuela. In September 2019, they rammed through an initiative to investigate human rights abuses in Venezuela and quickly gathered partisan supports of quote unquote experts to malign the country on the UN's behalf. So while they're oppressing their people, hey, look over at Venezuela. The resulting report obviously appears to be corrupt. None of these three experts leading the inquiry ever set foot in Venezuela while preparing the report, leading them to source their accusations of human rights abuses in the country to claim made by their former intel chief, Manuel Christopher Figueroa. Less than 1 year into his stint at the helm of Venezuela's National Intelligence Services, Figueroa sided with Guaido amid the coup's leader's attempted military takeover. Exposed as a failed revolt's highest collaborator, Figueroa fled to the U.S. after orchestrating opposition leader Leopoldo Lopez's escape from house arrest. And again, Leopoldo Lopez is the guy basically running this from the United States. Days later, the U.S. Treasury lifted personal financial sanctions on Figueroa. Now that he was in the U.S., he's fine. They had to sanction him because he was basically the CIA-trained insider in the government. And now that he's fled and he got outed, he's going to get all of his assets back. Though most Venezuelans officials do not maintain U.S. bank accounts, therefore dodging the impact of these unilateral asset freezes, a June 2019 Washington Post revealed that Figueroa's wife had already been living in Miami prior to Guaido's attempted coup, suspecting he was uniquely susceptible to Treasury's attempt and probably used as the leverage to get him to turn on his government. While reviewing the September 2020 Venezuela Human Rights Report, Anya discovered that virtually every accusation of human rights abuse and torture was sourced to Figueroa. Though they placed his testimony at the center of their investigation, the authors omitted any mention of his defection to Washington and his wife's bank accounts. The report's lack of credibility was further underscored by the fact that each of Figueroa's examples of alleged widespread torture and abuse occurred not recently, but from 2014 to 2018, a period he conveniently concluded when he took over the agency. So it was the other guy, not him. And again, no pictures, no evidence, just this guy's word. The 2020 Human Rights Report relied on outright deception. At the heart of the accusations of political repression leveled against Caracas were the cases of U.S.-backed opposition leader Leopoldo Lopez and former police officer turned terrorist Oscar Perez. While charging Venezuela's government with subjecting Lopez to cruel and inhumane punishment, the report avoided any mention of his role in the violent riots that paralyzed the country in 2014. It also failed to explain why it considered Lopez's detention, which confined him to house arrest that he spent with his family, to be cruel and humane. So he's involved in riots meant to overthrow the government. He's arrested and put under house arrest, allowed to live in his nice, beautiful villa, and somehow that's cruel and humane. Yet perhaps nothing in the 2020 Human Rights Report was so outrageous as its treatment of Oscar Perez. He was a former helicopter pilot for the criminal investigation units in Venezuela's police force. Perez shot to international fame during the riots in 2017. He hijacked his police helicopter, lodged grenades at the Venezuela Supreme Court in a terrorist attack on the court. After fleeing the scene, Perez released a statement in which he claimed to be leading a mutiny of the police and military defectors in a struggle of liberation for Venezuela. But the uprising of the military never happened, and the militant was forced underground until January of 2018, when a police raid on his hideaway resulted in a shootout that left Perez, 6 of his men, and 2 law enforcement officers dead. So the coup guy gets into a shootout after he's been hiding, after attempting to overthrow the government, and his death is a human rights violation. The report did acknowledge that Perez commandeered a helicopter and flew it over the Supreme Court, but however, it did not mention any of the grenades being loaded on there or any of the other, and him releasing a statement saying that he was orchestrating a coup. They classified his death as an unjustified extrajudicial killing, as he's in a gun battle killing police. So, who exactly was behind this piece of propaganda? Among its 3 authors, none of whom set foot in Venezuela, was a lawyer named Francisco Cox Viel. Before he ventured into investigating quote unquote human rights abuses in Venezuela, Cox worked as a defense attorney for Jovina Novia, a Chilean official who served as the general undersecretary of Pinochet. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? He represented a high government official on the Pinochet's government. Francisco Cox Viel is not a lawyer who qualifies as an expert in human rights. A Chilean sociologist wrote, arguing Cox's defense of people like Novia revealed him as a hypocrite. He is part of an operation against the government of Venezuela. The fact that Cox had previously defended a military leader in a dictatorship who oversaw the torture and execution of thousands of Chilean dissidents should have disqualified him from any role in any human rights report. Situated on the chilled banks of Lake Geneva, the UN Human Rights Office seemed to have leapt from the illustrations of a fairy tale, stationed in a building that originally housed the League of Nations. It was located in a plush area of Geneva. Anya encountered the people at the UN Human Rights Council in March 19th, 2019, speaking alongside a UN Special Representative Alfred D. Zayas and Lucrecia Hernandez, director of Caracas-based human rights organization, Sherez. Anya detailed her reporting from Venezuela at an event dedicated to exploring the impact of U.S. sanctions in other countries. A forceful attorney with a background in human rights law, Hernandez and her husband, attorney Cristobal Cornelius Pere, founded Sherez in 2016 to investigate the effects of US's financial warfare on Venezuela's economy and population. As one of the country's leading experts on the matter, Hernandez's presentation in Geneva thoroughly documented how Washington's sanctions had systematically undermined Venezuela's ability to survive. De Zayas, meanwhile, used his speaking time to deliver a scorching indictment of the entire UN Human Rights Office, accusing its functionaries as violating the most fundamental principle of methodology in its approach to Venezuela. As a renowned specialist in international law, he was uniquely qualified for such a role. De Zayas not only spent decades as a senior human rights official, but had visited Venezuela himself in 2017 in his capacity as a UN special representative. Fluent in 6 languages, the dual US Swiss citizen spoke in very certain terms as he addressed the room in Geneva. "We are swimming in an ocean of lies," he said. "When I went to Venezuela, I expected to find a humanitarian crisis. I was predetermined to find a humanitarian crisis. What he discovered was not that at all. That meant I had been manipulated. I had been lied to, and I resent that," he said. Though the situation De Zayas observed in Venezuela was not nearly as dire as he anticipated, the lawyer's 2018 UN inquiry still concluded that US sanctions amounted to modern-day medieval siege of a country. The report was just one example of his work as a legal scholar, primarily known for his contributions to the UN, where he used his senior position to argue in defense of other marginalized groups. De Zayas' independent streak informed an unorthodox and at times controversial approach to international law. In 1980, he published a historical review of the Weimar War Crimes Bureau. Through academic reviews, including being published in the Cambridge Law Journal, praised his scholarship, saying that his documentation of crimes was second to none. One of De Zayas' loudest detractor was UN Watch, a Geneva-based organization funded by the U.S.-Israeli lobby. Since its 1993 foundation, UN Watch served as Israel's most aggressive defender within the halls of the Human Rights Council, weaponizing its role as a so-called monitor to smear anyone that dares speak up against Palestinian rights or anyone opposed to Zionism. As such, UN Watch maintained its undying obsession with De Zayas throughout his career, and even issued a demand at the human rights officially condemn the lawyer's Venezuelan investigation on the basis that he had issued an independent version of what had happened in Germany. The UN Watch's bullying tactics was palpable during his own visit to the Human Rights Council. As we prepared to testify, a representative of the group arrived to inform the host, an Italian lawyer, that the UN Watch had booked the room for a session immediately following ours. And so as they go into session, this guy sat so that at exactly the right time, they could kick Anya and her, whether they went long or whatever, to make sure that he was like a hawk and was right there to make sure they didn't go over their time. The UN Watch was not the only special interest group that had outsized influence over the United Nations. As Anya chatted with people in the cafeteria, several complained that corporate and state-backed lobbying groups had strengthened their hold over the organization. One source specifically bemoaned the UN's increasing reliance on funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, a development that undermined its ostensible role as independent. Such concerns are justified by the fact that the second largest donor to the UN World Health Organization, for example, is the Gates Foundation. Despite the UN's shortcomings, individuals like Desaias and Sabia had dedicated their careers to being independent. Desaias went on to say the lack of professionalism on the part of the UN Secretariat is a disgrace and should be exposed by civil society. In the Diaz view, reports like Bachelet's were methodology had flawed methods applied to it, despite because they relied on overwhelmingly an unverified allegation of opposing politicians and advocates of regime change. He accused Bachelet and other UN officials of refusing to engage with Venezuela's government in good faith, arguing such breakdowns in communication eroded their authority and their commitment to human rights. Bachelet's ideological approach to her job stood in stark contrast to the pragmatic approach used by others. By establishing a rapport with the Venezuelan government rather than the US-backed forces trying to overthrow it, he yielded tangible results. In 2019, Desaias successfully lobbied Caracas to release 23 prisoners, including a German citizen, through a personal request filed by the country's foreign minister, the real one, not the pretend one. The foreign minister's name was Jorge Ariza. Zayas said, I asked Ariza personally to release the German journalist Billy Six, and he was released. What does that tell you? That if you have good faith and you mediate, you can get results. According to Desaias, his success was rooted in his status as a special envoy, which afforded him a level of autonomy that figures like Bachelet did not enjoy because she was in the tank. Desaias encountered such pressure himself while conducting his own Venezuelan inquiry, informing Anya that he experienced permission during mission and post-mission mobbing aimed at the report's outcome. He said that he was pressured, intimidated, and insulted by NGOs and even colleagues, but I was able to proceed with my investigation and learned a lot. He said, I'm not an ideologue. There are many in the UN Secretariat. The politicized nature of the Human Rights Council cast the UN's genuine commitment to its founding principles, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and self-determination in a very questionable light. Yet they publish these reports and think everybody doesn't know how corrupt they are. However, this was very obvious to many non-aligned countries in a non-aligned movement, which was the UN's largest member bloc. And so you basically destroy your credibility by issuing reports like that everybody knows is nonsensical. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and do this next part. If not for the international demonization campaign and economic siege waged against Venezuela, the country would be a hotspot for global tourism. Between its Caribbean coast, tropical islands, maritime mountains, and it's part of the Amazon rainforest, it hosts the largest waterfall in the entire world. And I didn't know that. I had to go on the web and look at that. It's beautiful, but it's in a very remote area. It also has Margarita Island, which is a moderately sized island located just miles off Venezuela's northeastern coast. Margarita's alabaster beaches and waters reflect an amazing area known as the Pearl of the Caribbean. And just by the way, I've been there. It's amazingly beautiful. I went all over the island. Um, it's crazy pretty. Guaido selected Margarita Island as the backdrop for his quote unquote presidential visit July 18th, 2019, traveling there on a small fishing boat. Bet he wouldn't do that now. There were a few dozen supporters that cheered him on his arrival at the beach. Later, he went swimming with local fishermen. While Guaido's backers, including some of the Western media, celebrated him as a hero, other Venezuelan social media derided it as a photo op. At the time of Guaido's Margarita tour, Anya was on her way back to the Venezuelan capital to cover a summit of the non-aligned movement, hosted by the country's actual government. The UN chartered a plane for its New York-based ambassadors to make the journey down, and the top diplomats from all over the world convened in Caracas. The Non-Aligned Movement Summit presented Venezuela's government with a timely opportunity to not only demonstrate that an overwhelming majority of the world's nations rejected Guaido's US-backed coup, but that it was capable of housing high-level diplomatic conferences in the middle of a sanctioned regime. Anya spoke with several of the UN dignitaries who expressed surprise at how normal Caracas looked, explaining that they had expected a less hospitable, even hellish landscape. Most of the prominent guests in attendance was included Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, who traveled to Caracas all the way from Tehran. Tapped as Iran's top diplomat in 2013, the Western educated, weird how so many of them are Western educated, isn't it? Guided his country's negotiations through the JCPOA, or the Iran deal. Upon Zarif's Caracas arrival on the eve of the Non-Aligned Movement opening day, his Venezuelan counterpart, Jorge Ariza, greeted him on the tarmac. Quote, "The resistance of the people of Venezuela against the U.S. is very important for all of the countries of the world." Zarif's comments set a defiant tone for the gathering. Throughout the meeting, Anya watched foreign ministers and senior diplomats from all regions of the world take the floor and make speeches. The most passionate intervention came from the Iranian representative, who in flawless English implored his fellow diplomats to ditch the term sanctions when describing US and EU's aggression towards their countries. He complained that the word had inadvertently legitimized the measures of framing them as punishment for wrongdoing. Zarif suggested another term. He wanted it to be called economic terrorism. This is the definition of the dictionary will give you of economic terrorism: unlawful use of violence or intimidation, especially against civilians, in pursuit of political gains. So he implored people to stop calling them sanctions. He characterized sanctions as a tool used by the EU and the US against governments that resisted being told who could lead their countries and who couldn't. The non-aligned movement was born from the developing world's desire of sovereignty in the collapse of the EU empires brought about after the Second World War. Founded in 1961 by post-colonial icons, Egyptian President Nasser, who we eventually overthrew, but we tried to coup him multiple times as well. And Guyanian president, I'm not going to know how to spell his name. His last name is Nkrumah. Iranian Prime Minister Nehru, and Yugoslavian President Tito, who we overthrew too. We just blew up his entire country. The non-aligned movement originally comprised an alliance of countries that sought independence from the US-Soviet power struggle during the Cold War, of which Sukarno hosted a meeting, and then they couped him too in Indonesia. The non-aligned movement in 2019's reunion in Caracas underscored the group's modern role in alliance building of powerful nations that wish to exist outside of the interference of the US in Europe and maintain their sovereignties. All of the diplomats that Anya spoke to at the non-aligned summit agreed that the modern transatlantic hegemony was enabled by the US and Europe's outsized control of the global finance system. This grip was largely based on two factors: dependence on the US dollar for international trade and the politicalization of the Society for Worldwide Interbank Finance Telecommunication, known as SWIFT. It was a Belgian-based network that processed nearly all money transactions. It's unlikely that average US citizens regularly consider SWIFT's existence or their dollar status as a world reserve currency. For foreign leaders struggling against the US and European economic wars, it's a big deal. For decades, the US dollar, standing as the world's reserve currency, has permitted Washington to implement unilateral sanctions against countries like Venezuela without UN approval. The dollar's privileged status was noted in Washington's historic relationship with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which enabled it to form the petrodollar system. Throughout the 70s and 80s, Saudi Arabia began overtaking the US and the Soviet Union as the world's largest oil producer. When Riyadh joined the Arab nations in boycotting crude sales to the US over Washington's support for Israel in 73, it triggered a global oil shock. Within a matter of months, the US was rocked by a sudden 40% surge in gas prices. In the summer of 1974, Richard Nixon dispatched U.S. Treasury Secretary William Simons and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger to Saudi Arabia with a mission to end the crisis. The resulting landmark arrangement saw Riyadh lift its oil embargo and purchase U.S. Treasury bonds in exchange for U.S. supplied military equipment. More importantly for Washington, however, that from 1974 on, Saudi Arabia agreed to sell all oil in US dollars. Due to Riyadh's significant share of the international crude market, the resulting influence over OPEC, the petrodollar arrangement protected them. Alongside the dollarization of global trade, SWIFT's historic willingness to act as an enforcer of US policy rather than as an autonomous institution compounded command and control. During the War on Terror, US quietly turned the US financial system into a hidden empire, said the New York Times. According to the Times, Washington used the power of the dollar and its influence over obscure organizations such as SWIFT, financial messaging service, to monitor its enemies. In some cases, to cut entire states like North Korea out of the financial world. These policies effectively pressed foreign banks into service as agents of US and European oligarchs. This maximum pressure strategy reached its height following the May 2018 withdrawal from the JPOA. The policy quickly put SWIFT's supported independence to test. In November 2018, the U.S. Treasury issued a threatening directive advising providers of specialized financial messaging service like SWIFT to discontinue the provision of such services to the Central Bank of Iran and other Iranian institutions or risk sanctions themselves. Swiss complied with demand and unlinked Iran's central bank from its network. Through Washington succeeded in transforming SWIFT into a political weapon, it ultimately undermined the system's long-term viability because everybody immediately started looking for other avenues. At the non-aligned movement, it was obvious that Washington's over-reliance on unilateral sanctions, particularly those in the oil production, such as Venezuela and Russia, had backfired. A push to trade in currency other than the dollar began immediately. The non-aligned movement's position was succinctly articulated by Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov when he addressed the roundtable. Quote, "Let's turn dependence into independence," he said. When Anya approached Ryabkov for an interview shortly following the session, hoping to gain insight into Russia's perspective of the global affairs, he said this: "I think it's very real when people here talk a lot about the policies of regime change. I hate finger pointing, but the sense of danger is very real." He was well acquainted with the modern legacy of imperial regime change, having entered the Soviet diplomatic corps in 1982 when he was just 22. Ryabkov had weathered a 4-decade history that spanned the Soviet Union's collapse and Russia's subsequent pillaging at the hands of international capital under Boris Yeltsin. The devastating NATO wars led in Yugoslavia to Afghanistan and eventually Vladimir Putin's effort to reclaim Russia's great power status. After a 4-year stint in the Russian embassy in Washington, he returned to Moscow in 2006 and was appointed deputy foreign minister. Though his tenure began during the Obama administration's attempt to reset U.S.-Russian ties, the West's quest for world domination drove relations between Washington and Moscow to a new low under Obama. And then he mentioned the regime changes in Libya, Syria, and Ukraine. The aggressive policy not only ousted sovereign governments, but both of which had previously enjoyed relationships with Moscow, but successfully embroiled Russia in costly military ventures. By the time Trump arrived in the White House, Syria and Ukraine's front threatened to spark direct military confrontation. However, any attempt by Trump to achieve détente was undermined by Russiagate hysteria and the U.S. media and political establishments undermining of anything that they tried to do. And then she talks about the Helsinki summit when Trump and Vladimir Putin tried to open dialogue. But she goes on to talk about how John Bolton undermined all of it. So that's crazy. Okay, that kind of brings us up to date with this. So,
can I just say that, okay, the NGOs, in my opinion, that, we were bringing up, is one of the missing pieces to the overall web that we've been reconstructing since the beginning of this journey. Because we saw how they used it in the creation of the World Wildlife Foundation and the UNESCO and all these other organizations that governments were funneling money into that were running as a nonprofit. So now all of a sudden it's like adding in these NGOs, and you then all of a sudden see how all the shutting down of USAID and all these other NGOs that are behind the scenes that Elon Musk had mentioned. Anyway, it was a big missing chunk, and we keep seeing it over and over and over.
Well, not missing from our research, because as we've uncovered them, we've talked about it. I think it's missing
Right.
for most people who don't know what we do,
Right.
because we've covered the NGOs from the very beginning.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Well, I guess that's what I'm saying is the missing piece of the conversation that a lot of these other groups never even brought up
Yes.
until Trump and them, and Elon Musk and so on and so on, started actually bringing to light.
Right.
And it's like they've been such a hinge point.
Yes.
Over and over.
The foundations, the NGOs, they all have a role in this. Absolutely.
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of the main chords they've used for decades and decades and decades.
Yep. Yep. Because, and they, even the names, I mean, come on. The Institute of Peace. Are you kidding me?
Right.
Yeah. The Office of Public Safety. Killing people.
Up is down, down is up,
Yeah.
Well, it's just like, and actually you could even go to the point of saying the transgender, what they call it, affirming care. Affirming care is nothing. It's brainwashing.
Yeah.
It's brainwashing and physical destruction.
Yeah.
And mutilation.
But put a good,
not self-care.
Right, but put a good name on it that sounds cool, and you can literally kill people. But just put a happy name on it.
Right. Institute of Peace.
Yeah. Yeah. It's crazy. How are you today, Stellar?
I'm doing good. Watching the floods go through the link and stuff like that over the weekend. It was wonderful. We had some rain. But yeah, more importantly, these people, I'm so glad they got, I had no idea that, step back, the active players back then, even though it wasn't that long ago, it does still seem like it was long ago. Those are still the same players today.
Yes.
And that's what blows my mind. And a lot of these skirmishes that are happening are leftovers from what was done from the past.
So, and that's an interesting point. Another reason why I wanted to do this, because so many of our deep dives have been very historical, although it's a pattern. This has all of the same patterns, but it happened within recent proximity to all of us. And we all experienced the propaganda campaign of painting Venezuela as this nefarious actor, when in fact, it basically, none of the print material that was put out there, none of the garbage that's on television tells you the real story. And the real story is out there. You just have to look for it, because you're not going to be spoon-fed it. You're going to be spoon-fed lies. And I'm actually surprised at some of the more prominent people that know about all of this stuff historically still gets Venezuela wrong. And it repeats the pattern. So instead of just taking 2 seconds and go, wait a minute, are we really trying? Is that a really bad government? Or, like in all of the other cases for over 90 different successful coups, are we being told it's a bad government when in fact it's just not the same type of government that we have, and they get to choose their own government? Where's that? That's the part that I keep missing, is where are those people who supposedly are enlightened and awake, not questioning this narrative?
Maybe because back in the day, like my generation, do you think is a Hugo Chavez? The media just always made it sound like, that they were communists, that they were really bad, and it's so close to America, and blah 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 blah. I mean, even to the point where they took out their gas from 7-Eleven. But in any case, do you think that could be part of what it is because he was just the boogeyman? They just
sure,
in the boogeyman,
but again,
and kept it
yeah,
continually to this
yes,
day?
yes. So if we know when the U.S. government, especially the intelligence, be the Washington Post and New York Times, is calling someone a boogeyman or a communist, based on what we know now, wouldn't the very first thing that goes on in your head going, wait a minute, let me just check that out? And I am telling you that some of the people that know the number of regime changes and talk about it on a daily basis will still tell you Venezuela's bad. How is that possible? That just blows my mind. Because if you're not going to look behind the curtain and you're going to use the talking points that are fed to you, I cannot tell you the number of times that some very prominent people that I know do read my post, I haven't responded to with, oh, great, you're in the John Bolton, Elliott Abrams boat. Does that make you feel comfortable? Hello, Renee.
Hey, Colonel. Hey, everybody. Hope everyone enjoyed their weekend. And I put in the purple pill. I don't know if you all saw, how Trump does his kind of interviews on Air Force One. Over the weekend, one of the reporters, it's at the 50-second mark in, asks him about Venezuela. So it seems like an update, and his response is very interesting. So I thought I'd share with you all. But yeah, regarding this Venezuela and following on X, totally agree with you that, it's all over the place, and we are just blessed, from being on this journey with you, Colonel. But the propaganda on Venezuela has been full on and really confusing. And I guess that's why it's all over the place, and the comments and what people think of majority. It's just so all over the place. I don't even respond or comment or anything anymore because it's so all over the place. But hopefully all will be revealed soon.
Well, what's interesting
Mexico is kind of on deck.
Yeah. And yeah, right. Yeah, what's going on in Mexico is truly interesting as well. Now, I have the vantage point of having just finished that 1,000-page book I finally read over the weekend. And I will be posting some additional information from that book about the network inside of Mexico, because it's truly mind-boggling. The historical interwoven CIA presence in Mexico, and the interaction between them and many of the large elements of drug trafficking into the United States. Truly mind-blowing. I mentioned that group, Syntac, which was kind of the whole purpose of that book. That reporter, writer, whatever you want to call him, Mills, was allowed to be embedded in Syntac for 5 years. And he traveled all over the world. And it's a mixture of people, good guys, that somehow got the authority to work at the national level outside of stovepipes. So one of my big takeaways is these organizations in our government has been purposely set up to stovepipe information in order to not know what's going on purpose. Even within the DEA, at the beginning of the book, it goes into quite a bit of depth because a lot of the guys that ended up on Syntac was pulled out of the DEA. But they tell stories about how the DEA is set up as regional offices. And the regional directors don't share information with other regional directors if they think that that other regional director is going to get a jump on some activity that's happening in their region. So the non-interoperability of the DEA, it's not like they're there for America. They're there for their own glory. And so obviously we know from the Gary Webb book, these are national networks. And if you think about overlaying a national criminal enterprise and the government's responsible for exposing it and holding those people accountable are fighting amongst themselves for glory, that you're never going to solve the national networks. You're not. And then you have the exact same thing happening at the FBI. Not only do they have a turf war with the DEA, but they have a turf war inside of the FBI. And then bring up the ATF, because every single one of these networks have guns. And so you have all of these stovepipe organizations that are so fucking petty among themselves, let alone with their other organizations. You don't have drugs in the DEA without weapons in the ATF. So how the hell do you ever solve it? You don't. And that's the reason why, and that was set up purposely for that exact reason. They do not want them exposed. You will get the street crime guy because the local police is going to get them, but you never get the network. And oh, by the way, every single one of these national crime organizations launder money. And they had no one on any of these organizations that track the money. That's a whole nother organization. So what Syntac did was it pulled Treasury people, it pulled DEA. They even had a couple of guys that had formerly been in the CIA that knew when the CIA was like when they were operating over in Asia trying to map this one network. They knew when the CIA was pulling shit with them. So a lot of their initiatives, even at Syntec, they arrested more and got convictions on more people at the higher levels, like the actual people bringing the drugs into the country, not the street guys, than any effort ever put together in the United States. So, of course, it was abolished because we don't want to do that. But during the time that they were operating, when they got to the Asian area, and they knew that the traffickers in Thailand, you know, and of course we know a lot more about Thailand than was even, I mean, the book's 1,000 pages already. They couldn't have put everything in it. But we know, and it does mention that the CIA set up the national police in Thailand post World War II. We know that they had $35 million funneled to them from the CIA. They were all in bed with the CIA. We know Paul Helliwell, what opened that Thai consul in Miami, the whole network. And of course, Paul Helliwell is mentioned in this book as well. So all of that information is known inside our government, and they didn't do anything to stop it. And it was enlightening to me to know that all of this information is known to government. They several of them, based on the regional area that they worked in, briefed Congress. They all know. There was a briefing to Lawton Chiles, the guy that represented my area, that was the Florida governor for a long time. They know these networks are out there, and they never stopped them. There was never, ever a whole of government effort to get the drugs out of the United States. So it it took me a good week to get through that book, but maybe a week and a half. But I couldn't put it down. It was a crazy book. And I will be sharing with you guys through some threads some of the information in the book, because some of the names I'd never heard of, like the guy that was running the Tijuana network, and it wasn't just in Tijuana. His house, he lived in Tijuana, outside of Tijuana. His last name was Falcon. He was eventually arrested, but even under arrest, he was running his drug empire from prison because he owned basically every politician in the Mexican government, all of them, right up to the president. He was making hundreds of billions of dollars, and almost every police chief. There was one good guy. His last name was Ventura, in Mexico, that they would seek out in order to bring in to make arrest when they needed it, because he was like the only guy ever that was not corrupted. He was not on their payroll. And somehow, even though his house was blown up and all kinds of other shit happened to him, they never killed him. And it's just an amazing story, and it outlines all of the stuff that we know, that all of these drugs between Peru, Bolivia, and they basically are in the production of the coca plant, which we already knew, shipping the shit into Colombia, and basically all of the ambassadors, all of the DEA chiefs, all of the CIA head of operations in Colombia were working to facilitate Colombia. And it talks about the narco elite, the narco terrorist, the CIA training them. Goes back to Carter, after he had fired all of the covert people, withholding helicopters from them, and all of the shit that Carter got for, I mean, they were leaking all kinds of shit to intimidate Carter into giving the Colombian government these 3 Black Hawk helicopters that they wanted, supposedly to root out. But his one question was, how do you guarantee me they're not going to be used in the drug trade? And no one could. It's crazy. Go ahead, Renee.
Yeah, the more we move forward on this journey, and I see in the beginning of this journey, when you talked about the wheel, it's like a wagon wheel, and blackmail is the grease, and then we and you always get, your account gets throttled, and you get shadow banned, you get all these problems, and I kind of feel, and I'm sure others do here as well, because it like almost parallels to the whole Epstein saga, and
Yes.
It keeps being held back because the journey of Operation Gladio and all its tactics and blackmail and leveraging of people and compromising people, this is how the whole world has been, we've been on this wagon wheel for quite a while. And Epstein is a handler, liaison, blackmailer, blah, blah, blah. And you're telling the story of it. So probably the reason why this information has been throttled, because it runs the parallel of this whole
Yes.
piece of the wheel.
Yes. I agree. And McModern over on Rumble says most of the county sheriffs along the border are corrupt as well. And you're absolutely right. They talk about that. The implications of, as a matter of fact, I just finished reading the book. I don't have it in the room with me, that the guy wrote about the Fort Bragg, and the drugs and the crime that was happening around there. And what you find is every single one of those local sheriffs and police departments did not hold anyone accountable for what they knew to be drug activity in the area. And what I was kind of interested about, it's not like he didn't know, because he does mention how most of these special operators are conducting CIA missions. He never once mentions about the CIA large presence at Fort Bragg, which I find very puzzling, because most of the operations and intel that Fort Bragg, JSOC, and all of the units there operate off of is CIA intel. The missions that they go on, all based on CIA. So you have on one hand the CIA running basically the entire, along with other intel agencies, drug network in the world, while at the same time you have trained assassins wearing a military uniform that are engaged at a very low level, trafficking drugs in and out of Fort Bragg. And they go hand in hand. These are the people that were deployed over there, working with the resurgence of the drug trafficking in Afghanistan. And he does, to his credit, talk about the role of the Taliban in how it's viciously maligned in the US press. But regardless of what you feel about all of the other crap that it did two things. We're very aware of their after the Soviet CIA presence in Afghanistan and the Taliban basically taking over after they left and eradicating the poppy. They also stopped child trafficking out of Afghanistan. And then he goes on to mention more recently, since we've pulled out of Afghanistan, the stopping of the opium again. It's almost completely eradicated again. And child trafficking stopped. So it's weird how everybody seems to have these little pieces of the puzzle, but no one's putting all the pieces together. Which is why we're here. Because now we can see the entire picture. Okay.
This damn Gladio prescription, I just can't even get it out of my eyes anymore. I see it everywhere. Just saying.
Yep. I agree.
The truth is an amazing thing, and everything makes sense now that we see it.
And I don't know if you guys saw the picture that I posted over the weekend of Stormy Patriot Joe wearing his Gladio glasses at Mar-a-Lago. I posted it. I don't remember when it was. He was invited to I'm not going to remember his name. James O'Keefe had a big gala down there for independent journalists, and Stormy Patriot Joe got invited, and he took a picture out by the pool with his Gladio glasses on with a couple of other guys. So
love it.
That's I know.
Awesome.
Yeah. So he texted that to me. Yeah, we all are wearing permanent Gladio glasses. Yes, we are, McModern. Yes, we are. All right. Somebody mentioned, McModern did too, about the DynCorp and the trafficking of people. Yes, DynCorp is one of the evil entities that we've covered before. They're very nefarious. Okay. And they make money off of war every single time.
How did they hide this from us all of these decades, from our parents and everything else? How did they hide this so well?
Because they own the media.
And everybody was working 2 jobs to support a family and kept raising the interest rates, raising the cost of living, not in proportion with the amount we were being paid. They kept us so damn busy. We never had a chance to stop and read and look, my opinion.
Well, there's obviously distractions, and there's one crisis after another crisis after another crisis that keeps you preoccupied of standing and recognizing that we're basically operating as debt slaves in a virtual prison. And you're fed. It's like being in prison, and the only news source you get is CNN. What we don't realize is whether it's Fox News or MSNBC or CBS or ABC, they're all together. There really is no separate um, entity. And it wasn't until the invention of not just the internet, but social media, where people could connect, and the researchers that are willing to put in time and effort into this. I could not do what I'm doing and have a full time job. This is literally not just a full time job, it's every hobby that people would normally be engaged in, too. It's time consuming to do all of this research and verify the facts of the information and kind of connect all of the dots. It's very, very time consuming. And the guy that I was talking to on the phone was talking about how he has all of this stuff electronically and all this other stuff. And I'm like, I just have it in my brain. I don't have time. I've never had time to sit down and do any of the electronic versions of all of this. And that's obviously a missing piece in this research that desperately needs to be done. But Illini's helped me. He's been scanning books so that I can do name searches and pull pieces together. So this is a big project, but it's it's very, very time consuming to do all of it. That's all I'll say. So it's easy to see, to me, sitting where I'm sitting, how it was all hidden, because you are being propagandized anytime that you're looking. And all of us grew up, all of us older people grew up with our parents watching the evening news, Walter Cronkite or whatever, and you were just being told what you were allowed to know, and none of it was true. Um, all of these exposés that the New York Times and the Washington Post, you go back 30 years, they were all propagandizing us. And 20 years, 25 years after the fact, they will do something on page 7 that, says, oh, yeah, back in 1970, something, something, then this happened. So that it's in there and they can say they covered it, but they never covered it at the time. And by the time they cover it, it's just this anecdotal, oh, yeah, that's history. Why is anybody even worried about that? So it's just a manipulation of everybody in this entire country, because that if everybody knew what we knew, we would all be collectively together, and they don't want that. They want us all in silos. So, okay.
I just wish they had an island for all of us to go to decompress every now and then. All of us who know all this information, because I feel, doesn't everybody feel sometimes we're like, come on, everybody, get on board this train of truth. And sometimes you just need a break. I need a break.
Yeah, no doubt. I agree 100%.
I think that's what these spaces are.
They're our island of coming together, and it's not a physical island. It's the best we could do at this point. But yeah, I agree. And like I told you, the few times that we do get together, it is such a revitalization. You feed off of other people physically. And so, like I told you, when I was at the Great American Restoration Tour in Cocoa Beach, it was so fulfilling to have people come up to me and like physically shake your hand and tell you that they had learned so much. That to me is energy that just perpetuates my enthusiasm for doing what we're doing and the confirmation that it's not a waste of time. So it is nice to physically get together, Renee. I agree with that 100%. Um, we're going to have another one of our Patriot get togethers um, this coming weekend. And if anybody lives in Florida, Central Florida specifically, and is interested in joining our group, you're more than welcome to. If you DM me, I will forward. I need your email address because we have somebody that takes care of the invites. So just reach out and you'll get your invite. Okay. I don't know. I told you guys I was laughing at Alpha about it. It would be so great if he moved to Florida, but I'm not sure we're ever going to get him in Florida because he's petrified of snakes and alligators, more importantly. Um, so anyway, maybe someday. All right. Kevin,
I heard him talking one night. He was saying how much he loved the girls there. So I thought for sure you wouldn't have a hard time getting him out there. He said that they were wild. And alligators are big. He lives in California, doesn't he? They've got snakes there. Tell him to stop being a little girl.
Yeah, not where he lives. I mean, he lives in a city. So, Kevin, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I saw the space was going on. There's a lot of talk right now with regards to potential push for war with Venezuela. I just wanted to know is like that what this is about, because I have some thoughts on that. So.
Well, basically, what we have been disclosing is firsthand accounts in Venezuela of what is actually going on there versus what we're being told in the news. And we started this series back with Elliot Abrams and John Bolton with their failed attempted coup to install Juan Guaido as the fake president. And we're going through the repercussions of that attempted coup and how all of that worked out. And we're kind of presenting the other side of the story as opposed to the story we're being force fed by the media.
So, okay, and essentially, if I understand correctly, you're critical of that push, right? Because when Bolton and those guys were essentially doing that, I mean, Bolton even said he wanted to do a coup by force. He didn't even deny it or downplay it.
Correct.
Or try to tout it as organic. He literally said in an interview, and I forget which interview it was, but he said, yeah, this is our sphere of influence. We're going to take control. That's essentially what he said.
Yes, that's exactly what he said. Yeah. And Elliot Abrams, we've covered the Iran-Contra thing at length. And the fact that Elliot Abrams was actually convicted of nefarious shit during Iran-Contra, him being one of the lead guys that Bolton used in this is very nefarious as well.
Yeah, I one thing that I appreciate about Bolton, like I've read one of his books, he's a very upfront kind of guy. Like a lot of these guys try to say, oh, well, we care about like human rights or we care about democracy, or they'll use like various like George Bush type rhetoric to justify their work. John Bolton is basically an offensive realist. He'll just say, hey, we have the military power, they have resources, we're going to go in there and take what we want. So at least he's an honest spokesperson for the war machine. But I want to get your guys' thoughts on something that I've been seeing a phenomenon recently, which is that a lot of accounts that call themselves MAGA or libertarian or even like America First that were very critical of the push for war in the Middle East or Europe in the last few years, a lot of them are now on board with the push for war in Latin America. What do you guys think about that?
We think it's bullshit. And as a matter of fact, we were just talking about that. It's mind-blowing that even people that know that the CIA has instigated over 90 successful coups around the world, sometimes in the same country multiple times, like in Ukraine, that they they know that this is something that happens, and we've lived through the propaganda when it was happening, and yet the same people are telling us that we have to go into Venezuela militarily. And you're like, at what point do you take a step back and go, ah, maybe I'm being manipulated again? And some of them,
Yeah.
like you said, it goes right over the top of their heads because the drugs, which is the purported reason they're using, all come from Colombia. They do not come from Venezuela. And we have seen repeatedly how the CIA will smuggle through underground networks drugs through a particular country to be able to go back because they want to regime change that country anyway, like Nicaragua during the Iran Contra, where they land Barry Seal's plane on the tarmac, roll out a bunch of cocaine, take a picture of it, and then say, oh, look, we've got to overthrow Nicaragua's government because they're trafficking cocaine. We've seen this repeatedly.
Yeah. So I got a theory as to why this sort of shift has happened, because normally people like NATO types just accuse everybody of saying the stuff they don't like of being paid. I don't actually think a lot of these guys that switched the tune on this are paid. What I think has gone on is the CIA and the establishment at large, they're smart in that they change up their narrative depending on what audience they want. So with the wars in the Middle East, the focus was on fighting terrorism and spreading democracy. That appeals to like a certain type of mostly like Libby type person. The war in Ukraine, similar sort of logic. It's like, oh, Russia bad,
right,
and democracy good. But the rhetoric that they've used in Latin America is very different. It tries to appeal to a much more anti-war audience to get them to support the war. What I've noticed when I've asked these guys, because I thought it was weird. I'm like, wait, but I used to see you guys post like anti-war memes, and now you're doing like let's go into Venezuela memes. What's going on? They will tell me, well, it's different now because we're fighting socialism or whatever. So the propaganda isn't, you're right to point out the drug stuff. That's the thing too. They've done that in a lot of these countries, but it's also coupled with, oh, you hate leftists or you hate left-wing stuff. I've got a war for you. So they managed to sell anti-war guys on war on an ideological basis. It's basically what I say is like the Monroe Doctrine is neoconservatism for libertarian people. It's the same logic. It's just instead of appealing to like Libby, brunch, democracy, human rights stuff, it's you don't like socialism? Okay, I got a neocon war for you. It's basically like if Bush had said we're going into Iraq to fight socialism instead of democracy, they would have supported it.
So, and here's my take on that. When you get down to actually stepping back and looking at this from, and I made this point a couple of shows ago during a different part of this book. If you look at what Venezuela was trying to do, Venezuela is a model of Libya. Venezuela had decided, right or wrong, and it's not the US's decision on what is right and wrong in a sovereign country. They decided that they were going to nationalize their shared resource of the oil, and that they were going to offer free medical, free education, free this, free that. And there are some people in America, although it looks exactly like what the Democrats are trying to do here, but all of a sudden it's not okay for Venezuela to use their natural resource of oil to do exactly the same thing. And I also pointed out that's exactly what Alaska does. Alaska views oil as their collective natural resource, and they send all of the people royalty checks every year as a result of the oil that is extracted in Alaska. So
yeah, Sarah Palin started that. She's like a Republican, but it's funny because a lot of people that voted for her are now saying that Maduro's the bad guy for
Right.
to do the same thing in the jungle. It's like if you do it in the snow, it's based and
Right.
conservative and America first, but if
Right.
you do it in the jungle, you're a commie and we got to go and invade you.
And that's exactly what Libya did. In the nationalization of their oil, they were able to do all of these social programs. And my response was, if you go to Scandinavia and you look at their plethora of social programs, they tax their citizens because they don't have these natural resources. They collectively tax the citizens and provide the exact same thing that Chavez and now Maduro was doing with their natural resources. So, is it okay to be semi socialist as long as you're taxing the people to do it because you don't have oil? And it's only wrong if you're doing it with the oil revenues.
Well, it's also funny too because Saudi Arabia basically runs a rentier state where a lot of people there don't even work. It's literally like welfare queens
Correct.
on steroids, and they use the oil revenues
Correct.
to pay for it. And guess what? If you do that, but you got an Arab last name, then the U.S. sells you $300 billion of military
Correct.
equipment. But if you do it and you've got a Mexican or Venezuelan sounding last name, then they're like, "Ooh, that guy's like Castro. Let's go and invade." You know, so
Yes.
take the oil.
Yes.
It's very goofy. It's very goofy, and I'll just say this: if Venezuela didn't have the largest proven oil reserves in the world, they would just pick some other country. So it's funny to me how a lot of the people who can clearly tell the propaganda when it came to Iraq or Afghanistan or Ukraine, they're completely blindsided just because whoever's pushing for it, like Marco Rubio, just uses the magic word socialism, and now like all their critical thought goes out the window, and now they're like, well, this is a just war, this is a justified war, and it's like, well, how, and it always then comes down to the drug thing when they try to rationalize it. But you're right to point out it's Colombia, and Colombia is a partner of the United States. There's no talk about going to war with them.
Not now, they're not. I don't know if you know that, but about 2 months ago, Trump dropped. He canceled the agreement because there is an official recognition partnership with countries in Latin America that supposedly fight drugs. And we had left that arrangement with Colombia for decades. Trump pulled it 2 months ago. And I said in one of our shows when we were covering Gary Webb's book about the Iran Contra and all of that other stuff, that the next step would be cutting off the aid, which he just did. And then the next step is to actually go in and do something about it. If you are ever going to justify a ground invasion of a country, it would be Colombia, not any other country. They are a narco state, and they're every level of government is captured in Colombia. Every level. The judges, if you're a judge in this book that I just finished reading, that was like 1,000 pages long, talked about one judge in Colombia that was actually investigating a drug trafficking network. 2 people on a motorcycle pulled up to her car and shot her point blank. The judges, the narco elite families, the senators, the entire police force, the entire military is part of a drug manufacturing organization. It is literally the very definition of a narco state. They don't even grow, for the most part, the coca leaf there. They get them from Peru and Bolivia. And of course, we had to coup Evo Morales because he was the one guy that said, yeah, we're not going to do this anymore. We legalized the production of the coca leaf, but they're not allowed to sell it. And you can use it to making tea and all of the other stuff that they actually historically had used it for. And what did we do? We overthrew his government. Because you're not allowed not to play in the CIA's drug network.
Yeah, it's amazing. Like, if you actually think about it, just in terms of the sheer numbers, the United States intelligence community is the largest pushers of drugs in the world. Like if you actually go back to the source of everything, and it's just wild because oftentimes the major victims of that are actually the people in the United States themselves. It's not even like they're selling it to other countries. Like when the British did the whole opium wars, it was to make the Chinese weak so that they could take advantage of them. But the U.S. regime, the U.S. ruling class, they do that to their own people. It'd be like if China did the opium wars against their own country.
But Europe is doing it to themselves too, because their intelligence agencies, MI6, Mossad, you find every one of them in these operations. I mean, the Colombian president had a Mossad IDF guy as his advisor. So it is a worldwide drug trafficking network ran by intelligence agencies collectively. It's not just the CIA. Every one of these research projects into different countries that we've looked into have the presence of others. And a lot of these drugs end up in Europe as well.
Yeah, and that's important to note. I just, to me, like whenever I hear like this sort of rhetoric now that's pushing for, you know, the regime change or this sort of logic on all these other countries, it's always conveniently the countries that are like resisting that, essentially. You know, like I mean, you mentioned Libya, obviously Venezuela is an example of this, where it's like, okay, there are only a few countries in the world that are like firmly outside of the control of Mossad and the CIA and MI6, and they just conveniently happen to be the ones that we're being told we got to go into. You know, it's sad. It's sad.
Well,
like your tax money is paying for that drug network. Essentially, it's the same in Canada. So
the other aspect of this that we haven't discussed today, although we've discussed it a lot, is they only do this if the country has resources they want. And that's why there's a level above the intelligence networks, which we refer to as the international syndicate, that wants control of the entire world's resources. And obviously, in the case of Venezuela, it's the oil companies. And in the case of Libya, it was oil companies. The only countries that we don't invade are already in collusion with us. They already, like the US and the UK, had concessions in Saudi Arabia, like Aramco. So they basically were all getting rich off of the resources in those countries. If you go back in time to the early 1960s, when the Congo had uranium, and it was basically the only supply, it was the largest supply of uranium at the time. When Belgium finally gave it its independence and they elected Patrice Lumumba, they wanted control over that uranium. And Patrice Lumumba made it very clear that Belgium was not getting a penny because they were no longer a Belgium colony. And so the CIA went in and killed him. And then they put in their stooge, and they got control of their uranium again. And Belgium's mining company still got to mine the uranium. And so there is a level above that that directs all of this, and it's all based on resources. Texas, Annie, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I'm shopping, loading groceries into my car. I didn't know I hit the mic.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
All right.
Nigeria is a good example of what's going on too with the petroleum, and Bolton and a lot of the same cats have their fingers connected to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's always about the resources, and they want control so they can get rich and we can be poor. That's kind of the bottom line over all of this. Control over everything. All right. We're going to go ahead and call it a day. We'll be back tomorrow. We probably will be finished with this book this week. And then we will move on to our next book because it's a crazy book. But anyway, thanks everybody for being here. Thanks, Kevin, for coming up and joining the conversation. And we'll be back tomorrow at 4:00. Take care, everyone. See you guys later.